We need a guy for He was the dean of the history department in presidency.
And the popular kept my phone doing it.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another meeting of the Madras Book Club, and a very warm welcome to our old friend of the book club and a member of the book club.
Can't hear you.
Paid up, I hope.
Yeah, the mic is not.
Mic is not. 1,500. That's it. Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Very old friend of the club and a paid up member I just heard. V. Sriram, who insists on being called an entrepreneur. But he's also a storyteller. And I think that's far more interesting than his entrepreneurship. His story today is going to be focused on an institution which is a great favorite of both his and mine, Fort St. George. This government was very, very keen on getting back to Fort St. George, not merely through election, but not occupying that monstrosity that was built on Mount Road, but to go back to where governance began. Both Sriram and I tend to believe that the Madras of today had its beginnings in what is Fort St. George. We have had lots of people tell us that there was life in this area where Fort St. George is long before Fort St. George was established. I have no doubt that their life existed. We can go back to Kumarikandam and we find that life would have existed in that area and all over the area. We can go back to the Cholas and the Pallavas and we find that life existed. But in all that reading of that ancient history, we never came across the name of Madras. And the name of Madras really comes from the period 375 years ago when Fort St. George was established on a strip of land which was curiously in the agreement called Madras Patnam. But despite being called in the agreement Madras Patnam, there is no other reference to it elsewhere. And that elsewhere is what we're going to talk about today. There's a whole heap of books on Madras. Some of you might have read a few of them, some of you might have heard a few of them, but I think Sriram has read almost everything that has been written on Madras. The other day we found one you hadn't written, the two you hadn't read. But the fact is there's been a surprising amount of material written about Fort St. George, and I think the most recent work on Fort St. George itself, just as an entity, was N.S. Ramaswamy's. And since N.S. Ramaswamy wrote this book around 1970s, 1977, we've had no other writing on Fort St. George per se. We've had writing on history of Madras and various aspects of it. But Fort St. George itself is a fascinating history. More important than the stories is a visit to Fort St. George. How many of you here have visited Fort St. George? It's not too bad. Much more than I expected. But what you need when you go to visit Fort St. George is Sriram as your guide. And that's when you get all the stories about Fort St. George. And in every little nook and cranny of Fort St. George, there is a story to be told. And most of those stories are fascinating little stories. And every other day, Sriram comes up with another story. Yesterday, he turned up with that there's a thing called the Clive Library. First time I heard of it. And we're going to discover whether Clive knew how to read or did not know how to read. That's something we have to discover. So that's what our talk is going to be. But before I let Sriram get on with it, let me first of all thank all of you all for cooperating with us and bringing your membership card. For that, I'll bring all that. In future, if you There will be only a limited number of guests as such, but every member will be warned well in time for our meetings, and we look forward to continuing to cooperate with us. For those of you who are, now that it's mostly members, I can cut down my spiel a lot and remind you that if you haven't paid your subscriptions, it's $850 for a year and $1,500 for 2 people. Jayanti and Gopi have joined the team there, and Virosa is there. They'll all help you out on these things, and we look forward to a more regular membership turning up for our meeting. Thank you very much, Sriram.
Thank you very much, sir. This being the 375th year of Fort St. George, Madras Musings began a column on looking at the various aspects of the fort, and that column promises to run for the next 25 issues. And that is how this interest in the fort really began. And during the course of this research for that column, I have tried to read as many books as possible on the fort. And so I'll be taking you through this presentation, which first lists out some of the well-known books on the fort, and then it looks at the various parts of the fort, and I'll try and read out a few passages from the books which refer to these particular locations and certain interesting stories. The presentation is structured to be for around 55 minutes, and I'll promise you that I'll end it on the 55th minute. So, if you look at the various books that we have, prior to this, this is of course one of the oldest books that is in print and is also available on the internet as a free for download. It's called Madras in the Olden Time. And for those who can't see that, this is the book. Written by a man called Tallboys Wheeler, and started in 1861 and ended sometime in the 1870s. It was originally a column for the Madras Mail, and then later it was compiled in the form of a book. This particular one is a reissue. It's a reprint that was issued around 10-15 years ago. But there is a very nice free for download copy available from Google Books. Then we have Vestiges of Old Madras, which is really the best book on the city. Actually, I shouldn't say book, but I should say books, because it is 3 volumes plus an index. This was written in 1913 by Henry Davison Love, the man who came to Madras as part of the army and then went on to become associated with the College of Engineering, became the principal of the College of Engineering. And what is very personally fascinating to me is that he also wrote a book on hydraulics, which happens to be my business, and then went on to write this particular book called Vestiges of Old Madras in 1913. The book, as I said, is 3 volumes and then an index, which so in a sense it is 4 volumes together. And it is really the most comprehensive account of the history of the city, starting from 1639 and ending in 1800. The previous book, Tallboys Wheeler book, ends in 1746, with the coming of the French. And this one takes it by another 50 years and ends it in 1800. Love wrote a number of other companion volumes, and this is just not his only work. He also wrote a book compiling the various works of art that are available in the various government houses in Madras Presidency, and that again is a fascinating one. So he's written a number of other books as well, but this is really his most famous work. The next book is The Nawabs of Madras. The Nawabs of Madras is personally my favorite, though Mr. Muttaya doesn't like it all that much. He thinks Vestiges of Old Madras is a far better book. The Nawabs of Madras is full of scandal. Every page has got something or the other unsavory about people. And it is written by Henry Dodwell, who was the curator of the Tamil Nadu Archives, or the Madras Records Office as it was called at that point of time. And the book was released in 1926. I have a moth-eaten copy here, which is now in 3 parts, but I'm holding on to it. It's kept in a special bag all the time and brought out only on certain occasions. I lose the bag very often, and then I keep searching for it very desperately, but it still is one of my favorite readings. This is a very unlikely candidate to be here, This is called the Science Congress Handbook, written in 1922. Apparently, the Indian Science Congress was held in Madras that year, and they decided to bring out this book, and it has nothing to do with science. The book has got one chapter on the fort, one chapter on St. Mary's Church, one chapter on the Connemara Library, and one chapter on other parts of the city. So it has got nothing to do with science. It's got a lot to do with the city, but it's a fairly interesting book. The finest account of St. Mary's Church, as far as I am concerned, the most cogent account, is found in this particular book. Then you've got Memories of Madras. This is a reprint, and this was brought out by the editor of the Mail, Sir Charles Lawson, and this again has got a significant part of the book dedicated to Fort St. George, and then it looks at various other parts. Then the Madras Tercentenary volume, released in 1939. I've just pulled out a couple of pages from it, but this book again is a fairly interesting collection of articles written about the city, in which the fort looms quite large. The Lives of the Governors of Madras is a study by itself, and I have put up two books here. One is Elihu Yale, the American Nabob of Queen Square, written in 1939 by Hiram Bingham. Hiram Bingham was an American senator who studied in Yale University and became very fascinated with the life of Elihu Yale. Came down to Madras, researched Yale's life, and then wrote this book. And it is again a fascinating book. It's a wonderful book. In fact, it's a no-holds-barred look on Yale's life, all his strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats and everything. And the other book, which turns 100 this year, which I haven't brought with me because it's now become very, very old, is The Life of Thomas Pitt by Cornelius Neil Dalton, written in 1915. And that book again has got, among various things, it's got one of the most comprehensive maps of Madras, which was brought out by Pitt himself in the early 1700s. So it's got a kind of a fold of that particular map, which again makes that book very, very interesting. Then you've got Munro. Thomas Munro's life has been written several times, and those books are also interesting. They give you some details. This is one of my personal favorites, and the story of Fort St. George, which is so thin, but it is actually a heritage walk of Fort St. George, written in 1948. So you walk around the fort following the guide given here, and you will find that substantially the fort has remained the same. It hasn't changed all that much, barring one or two very ugly buildings that have come up since then. So that really, and then the other old books, you've got Fort St. George by Mrs. Frank Penny. Her husband was the Reverend Frank Penny of Madras, so it's a fairly sanctimonious work. It keeps talking about how we have to bear the black burden and stuff like that periodically. Every once in a while she'll sing that note, and it's a little painful. Then the two books that Mr. Muthaiah mentioned yesterday, and I had not come across them before, Vicissitudes of Fort St. George by David Layton, and I found a free download copy on iBooks, which I have now got on my iPad, and The English Factories in India 1634 to 1671 by William Foster, of which one copy exists in the Madras Club Library in the Not for Lending section. So you have to go there to be able to read that particular book. Then there are the Park manuscripts. Robert Park, who was governor of Madras, went back, and then his manuscripts were discovered several years later. Henry Davison Love, who wrote Vestiges of Old Madras, recommended that they be compiled, and they have been compiled into 1,200 pages of the most boring information possible. And that is Park's contribution. Then you've got The Story of Madras by Glyn Barlow, which is also a fairly interesting book. Then you've got the modern period. The Founding of Madras by N.S. Ramaswamy, Orient Longman, 1977. Madras rediscovered by, it's actually Madras discovered and then rediscovered in its subsequent editions by Mr. S. Muthaiah, which is now into its 8th edition and going strong. And then we have Madras, its past and present, which I didn't bring today, but some of the most beautiful black and white photographs of the fort taken by, which are part of the Vintage Vignette collection, and then published with a commentary by Mr. Muthaiah. And then we've got 3 books, which again are very interesting books. One is the brilliant intact compilation, which is called Madras, the Architectural Heritage, written by Kalpana and Frank Schiffer, and the first 1/4 of the book deals with the fort. And it's got detailed maps, engineering drawings, and a commentary on the architectural features of the various buildings. It's a very, very well written account of the fort's architecture. And then Captain Ramchandran's book, Empire's First Soldiers, which deals with the Madras Regiment, which started off from Fort St. George. Then Mr. Narasaya's book, Madras. That again is an interesting book. So with that, these are really the books which are available about the fort. There may be any number of books in French as well. We have no idea, because for 3 years Madras was occupied by the French, 1746 to 49, and Love in his book keeps referring to them. Unfortunately, he gives us the French text because he assumes that all the readers know French, and it's very difficult to understand what exactly is written. So it's even my younger son, who claims to know quite a bit of French, couldn't proceed beyond the first line, so we left it at that. Now read this book, this guidebook which I mentioned to you, is interesting because it gives a set of maps of Fort St. George as it grew over the years. And so this is really the first map of the fort. The water body that you see below is the sea, and the water body that you see above is an Elambur river. And in between them you have this little building which is the fort, and you will see a better representation of it. This is the original fort building, the adobe which is in the middle with a square, and then an outer fort that was built a little while later. And what is interesting is that the fort today is not the fort that you see here. It was completely rebuilt in the 1750s. But this particular building alone still survives. What was built in 1639 is still standing, but it is not possible to see it at all because it is now part of the Chief Minister's office and the Tamil Nadu Secretariat. It is completely built in and still survives. So this particular adobe, the adobe may not be there for all you know, but the original square which you see surrounding it still exists. So the original fort continues to survive, which is perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of our history. Then this is of course the stamp that was the cover that was released recently to commemorate 375 years of the fort. And Mr. Hemchandra Rao used that image of the adobe and on the cover because he signified that this was the first construction that took place in Fort St. George. Then the fort in 1748, as you can see, has extended up to the river. And in 1750s actually, this shows 1862, it had brought in a part of the river and had grown beyond it. And then in 1939, this is the fort that we see today. So this structure that you see really comes up from the 1750s. Prior to that, it extended and extended, but its current shape is from the 1750s, barring a few additions and deletions and so on and so forth. Now, the various aspects of the fort as seen in the various books. So I'll take you through the fort now. So what is the first element that you see when you come to Fort St. George? You see the bastion and you see the flag post. And the one more view of the flag post over here. The flag post, as you may know, is one of the tallest flag posts in the country, 150 feet, and made of a single mast of teak wood till 1994 or 1995. It survived from 1685 till 1995, when it became weak and had to be replaced by a steel mast of the same size. And in the process of taking it down, they cut it into several pieces and abandoned it in a storeroom. So that was the end of the teak mast. But that particular teak mast was the mast of a ship that foundered on the sea coast. And Elihu Yale, who was then the governor of Madras, had the mast brought in. In 1687, the fort received the permission to fly the royal flag, which is King James' flag. And then a celebration was called, and the masthead that had been, salvaged from the ship was used for putting up the flag. And the same mast continued to fly the Union Jack and then the Indian national flag till 1994. Now, Hiram Bingham gives you a little bit of how the flag was hoisted on the first evening when, the charter was received and then the celebration took place. The garrison and the train bands were ordered out. The chief inhabitants of all nations were invited to the solemnity. It was a cause for rejoicing. The governor gave a handsome collation upon the Fort House terrace, where he was accompanied with the council and chief of the Right Honourable Company's servants, most of the eminent freemen and inhabitants of the city of all nations and castes, the garrison's 3 companies being in arms, and also the trained bands consisting of nearly 100 Englishmen. After an orderly march around the fort, the garrison soldiers drew around within the fort and the trained bands without, when upon hoisting the Union flag upon the standard of the English bastion, the governor began a glass of Toby. Now there's been a lot of controversy as to what is this glass of Toby. Love and other people think that Toby is probably toddy, and the clerk who wrote it was probably high on Toby or toddy, so he didn't know what he was writing. But several years later, apparently there is a kind of beer which is known as Toby. And what is interesting is, Yale University in 1921 discovered that there was a connection between Yale and Toby, and all their beer mugs ever since then are made in the profile of Elihu Yale. And that is what is given to students who pass out from the university every year. That has a connection to this piece of writing about the glass of Toby. So the glass of Toby was drunk to our gracious king's health, and then the royal family's health, and then his happy and long reign, which was duly performed by all here, and then honoured with 3 volleys of small shot, and as many cheerful hurrahs from all the soldiers, and 31 pieces of ordnance, which was answered by the ships on the road. So the ships in the sea then answered all the salutes that were happening. Now in those days there was a terrible chairman for the East India Company, a man called Josiah Child. So they decided that they would fire salutes for him also, because he would get to know and then fire them all. So 19 guns were fired for the East India Company, and then the same number for the Honourable Governor Sir Josiah Child. And more to honour this occasion, several prisoners were freed, general contributions to the poor, and the soldiers were as merry as the punch could make them. The punch being a combination of 5 different things, which is like panchada, which became punch over a period of time. Sugar syrup, rum, and then a couple of other things which I quite forgot. So till night silenced all in repose. So since then the flag has been flying till 1932, when Tara's grand uncle decided that he had to climb up the flagstaff. Arya Bhashya, the freedom fighter, early one morning he climbed up the flag post, climbed all the 100 feet up, went up and hoisted the Indian national flag, and then tore the Union Jack and threw it down. Down below a welcoming committee was waiting for him. So having come down at reasonable height, he pounced on all of them and thrashed a few policemen and was arrested and taken to the magistrate's court. And he was asked to express an apology, whereupon he said that he was delighted with what he had done, and what had given him great happiness was that he had beaten up a few policemen as well. So he was then sentenced to imprisonment. Bhashyam, after independence, refused to accept the pension of a Tyagi and went on to become an artist, and the portrait that we all recognize of Subramanya Bharati was done by Bhashyam. So that was Bhashyam's claim to fame and the flag post. Then what you see here, this is not a good photograph. This is the original entrance to the fort. This is actually right below the flag. Today everybody gets into the fort. If you are a VIP, you get in through one of the brown granite gates that were constructed in 1910. But the original gate is actually below that, and that is called the Sea Gate, and this is the gate through which everybody would have got in at one point of time. This was the gate till the Second World War, when the gate was blocked up because they felt that enemies, aliens would be able to come into the fort, and then of course the upper gates which had already been constructed, they continue to be used. So the Sea Gate is the original gate. The book, Glyn Barlow's book, which is The Story of Madras, has got a very, very dramatic description of the Sea Gate. And it talks about how they would have waited for ships to come and, wait near the, outside the Sea Gate. How the news would have gone out that, a ship had come and what goods it had brought and things like that. So it makes for one of the most interesting. In former times, the company had a considerable fleet of first-class sailing ships. And owing to the frequency of wars with either the French or the Dutch, the company obtained permission to equip their ships as men of war armed with serviceable guns. And then he goes on to describe how the sea gate was used. And he talks about like this: there was good cause for excitement whenever a ship was sighted. The ship brought letters from home, perhaps after several months of no news at all. There were the private letters that told the news about near and dear ones. There were the official letters that decreed appointments in the company's service and promotions and penalties. Invariably, when a ship came, one governor would be demoted and put in chains and another governor would take his place. And then there would be the newsletters, the old-fashioned predecessors of the modern newspaper, which were written by paid correspondents whose duty it was to give their clients news of London and of England and of Europe. The news was often outstanding and sometimes extraordinarily behind time. For example, the company employees in India were still professing loyalty to the most high and mighty King James II, 1 year after that monarch had fled to France and had been succeeded by William and Mary. And the employees at Madras were surprised indeed when a ship arrived one day from England with the belated news. The salutes have been fired and the vessel has been surrounded by a flotilla of surfboats and catamarans. The commander and the passengers are being rowed ashore, and the governor with his councillors, dressed all of them in their smartest official attire, are waiting on the beach outside the sea gate of the fort to bid them a hearty welcome. Among the passengers, there are probably some youths who have been posted to Madras either as apprentice writers or as military cadets. And perhaps there is a senior employee who is returning to India after the rare event of a holiday in England. Possibly too, there are some ladies, either wives of employees who have been willing to accompany or to follow their husbands to the mysterious East, or, as was not infrequently the case, the young ladies who, with the consent of the directors, had been shipped out to India by their parents or guardians or on their own account, in the hope that the companionable bachelor employees pining in their loneliness will jump at the chance of matrimony. Now, were they really pining away at loneliness? Let's see what Let's see what a captain from Madras had to write about the general moral turpitude, as Bertie Wooster would have said. So he says, this man writes about how a Captain Sampson in Tranquebar has gone away on an expedition, and his wife and 2 waiting gentlewomen immediately board a ship to Madras to give company to Mr. Francis Day, for whose residence and for whom I believe Mr. Day has built a house equal to the one that she lived in at Tranquebar. It couldn't be smaller, because then you know what the interpretation would be. So, nevertheless, I am of the opinion that the company will pay for it, for he would invariably demand that the company pays for it. Then he talks about other people. Mr. Thomas Peniton, another of your factors on the coast, is by estimation worth 80,000 riyals. The term that he uses for the mistresses is gentlewomen, and he says he had married 2 gentlewomen to 2 soldiers and continues to live with them, and yet a third is resident with him. So this man obviously has got 3 establishments. Mr. Thomas Winter, another of your factors on the coast, is by estimation worth 20,000 riyals. Besides in adventure upon the Hopewell, then there's a ship. He had married his gentlewoman to a soldier, but by her he has had 2 children, one of which came to England in the ship called the Mary. And Mr. Day and he are very well versed in gaming, so they go out shooting every day. Mr. Henry Greenhill, another of your factors on the coast, is by estimation worth 12,000 riyals. He keepeth a gentlewoman by whom he had 2 children. At the christening of his second child, there was a gun salute from the fort, and of 13 guns, and the powder was paid for by him, so he paid for the gunpowder. And he has built for this gentlewoman, who incidentally formerly belonged to Mr. Day. So she was Francis Day's woman, and when he left Madras, he passed her on to Greenhill, a very fair house with an orchard and a garden, in which house he himself lodgeth every night. So this was the general moral turpitude at that point in time. Greenhill incidentally died of what I can only think of as some kind of dropsy, because the biography says he was much swelled and then had to be pierced to let out the fluid, and then poor man, he died because of that. And so that's it. So then you have the assembly building. The assembly building, of course, was built in 1910, and as I said, it encloses the original structure of Fort St. George. What is interesting is that this structure may be 1910, but inside it there are assembly chambers, the council chamber, which probably was built in 1861, because the Madras Legislative Council was the first council to be started in the whole country. And then it became an elected body in 1890s, after which it has had elected representatives. Then much later came the Madras Legislative Assembly, when the presidency became a bicameral legislature. But what is very interesting are those pillars that you see over there. They are all made of a locally available granite stone called Pallavaram gneiss. And it's also known as Charnakite. It is named Charnakite after George Charnock, the man who founded Calcutta. And they actually form a set of 32 pillars that originally led in a colonnade from the sea gate right up to the sea. And it was a kind of a processional walkway which later became a go-down, it became a market, it became a boutique, several things. The French took it all away when they sacked Madras and it was taken to Pondicherry. But when the British sacked Pondicherry in the 1750s, they brought back all the pillars and then they remained outside once again. Finally, when the assembly building was built, all the pillars were put in the assembly building as lining up the verandas. All they require is a bit of polish to make them shine. But somebody along the way decided that it is cheaper to paint them in black. And so the pillars are all permanently painted in black. They've lost their original gloss because of that. That's the way we take care of things. Then we have the Cornwallis cupola. The rotunda, this is not a great photograph once again taken by me, so you must excuse the quality of the photographs. Cornwallis, as you all know, fought the third battle with Tipu Sultan and then took his children as hostage. And when he went back to England, a statue was commissioned in order to commemorate him, and this was given to a man called Thomas Banks. And Thomas Banks sculpted the statue showing Cornwallis standing on top, and then in the pedestal there is a depiction of Tipu Sultan handing over his two sons to Cornwallis as hostage. And then the statue was put up. The statue, for all that it was a statue, it travelled much more than what Cornwallis did really. Because originally it was in the fort, then it made it to the fort square. And what is very interesting is that Charles Lawson in his Memories of Madras says that when Cornwallis came back a second time to India as Governor General, he came to Madras and he actually gave a speech standing below his own statue in Madras. He says he addressed the troops, and this is probably the only incident where a kind of a representative of the king came and stood under his own statue to give a speech. But the Governor Generalship didn't last very long because he went to Bengal and then died very soon after that. Now this rotunda, under which he stood, moved along with him because the statue kind of was originally in the parade square. Then when Cornwallis died, the public subscribed to building a memorial to him, which was put up at Cenotaph Road. Which is why, it's a memorial is a cenotaph, and the statue moved and went and stood under that for some time. Then it went into the Connemara Library. I have never understood what took the statue to the Connemara Library. Made its way back to the fort, and then in 1930s, Lord Erskine said that it should be brought here. In between for some time, or whether after that, I have no idea, an identical cupola was built on First Line Beach, where the statue I don't think ever moved, but the cupola stood there. And then finally the statue moved inside the Fort Museum and the rotunda has been standing over here as it is. It is very well taken care of, and because it is in the public eye and very close to the Secretariat, nobody uses it as a toilet. But the First Line Beach one is every day used as a municipal latrine. And you can't look inside it under any time, but you know where it is because you just have to follow your nose and you'll identify it. Then this is the famous Fort Square, where the parade square, where the soldiers were marched every day because this was a garrison fort. And facing that is the Secretariat building that was built in the 1950s. And behind that is the Tamil Nadu Assembly building, whose front you saw. The rear is actually even more beautiful than the front, going by the photographs. But it is now completely hidden by this Secretariat building and you can't make out most of the original structure of the assembly. And then you come to St. Mary's Church. St. Mary's Church is considered to be the oldest Anglican church built east of the Suez Canal. So built in 1670s by Governor Stransham Master, and Elihu Yale, who was then working under Master, was one of the contributors to the church. Yale got married in this church to his friend, Mrs. Catherine Hinmer, the wife of his late friend, Hinmer. But Yale was just not Mrs. Hinmer alone. He also had Mrs. Nix, and he also had Mrs. Deepaiva, a Jewish man, merchant's wife. And what is very interesting is there is a record in Vestiges of Old Madras which gives the streets where they lived. And Yale's house is exactly between the houses of Mrs. Nix and Mrs. Deepaiva. So one of them must have come in through the front door and the other one must have come in through the back door at all times. Mrs. Yale was understandably not in the least happy with this arrangement and went back to England. Whereupon Yale and Mrs. Paiva and Mrs. Nix lived happily ever after. Then Yale went back to England, Mrs. Nix went back to England. Mrs. Deepaiva died at the Cape of Good Hope. What is very interesting is Mrs. Nix, who I consider to be the first woman entrepreneur of Madras because she printed invoices even in the 1680s, preferred to come back to Madras and live here rather than live in London. So at the end of her life, she came back here. And she predeceased Yale. Yale didn't know that she was dead. He was already writing out his will. So a substantial portion of his legacy goes to Mrs. Nix and her children. The last mention in the will is to my evil wife. I leave the following items. That's how Yale's will concludes. But Yale has contributed to this church. What is interesting is that the church has been built in various phases. The steeple definitely did not exist when the church was originally planned. And let's see what the Indian Science Congress book has to talk about the church. The internal dimensions of the building are of their original size, namely 86 feet by 56 feet. The tower was not part of the original building but stood apart from the church. It was built by the order of Sir John Goldsborough at the end of the 17th century, but was not connected up to the end of the church until much later. The spire was added at the beginning of the 18th century. Some old prints show the tower without the spire. With this exception, the fabric of the church remains practically as it was when it was first built. There are certain unusual characteristics about the actual building in which it differs from others in the fort. One of these is the exceptional thickness of the walls and the roof, which latter is of the wagon or rounded shape, making it bomb-proof. The reason for this lay in the fact that the builders intended their church to be capable not only of withstanding violent storms but also impregnable to enemy assault. History has shown justification for their hopes. The church was built at a time being the only bomb-proof building in the fort, and although one directed modern shell would no doubt level it to the ground, nevertheless during all these years it has stood more or less intact. And then he goes on to describe the interiors of the church. The vestries at the end of the church were not part of the original building but were added less than 100 years ago, and slight alterations made in the shape of the east end of the nave. But the main building remains with these small exceptions precisely as it was built by our forefathers. And then some of the interesting things that are inside the church. There is of course the Bible that was used by Stransham Master, the man who built the church. That itself was gifted to the church and still continues to be there. The marriage register of the church is available and you can inspect the date on which Robert Clive married Margaret Maskelyne in this church in the 1750s. There is also a baptismal font made of granite in which all three of George Charnock's daughters were christened. And there are several such interesting little nuggets over there. 4 governors are buried in the church, and one of them has got no name because he died under mysterious circumstances, Lord Pigot. Nobody knew where he was buried till the 19th century, when a grave was discovered and the Duke of Buckingham and Chandos, who was then the governor, declared that this is the grave of Lord Pigot. So today there is a black granite slab on top of it which just says in memoriam and nothing further. This is the governor's pew where the governor would have sat at one time. Later the church organ was housed over here. This is really one of the most beautiful buildings inside Fort St. George and very, very peaceful. And today we have a woman pastor, the Reverend Kriba Elizabeth, who is very happy for visitors to come outside of service hours and wander about the church. And she knows quite a bit about the church history herself. The church yard is lined with a number of tombstones, and all these tombstones originally were where the High Court of Madras is today. When the French left, it was found that they had used these tombstones for mounting their cannons, and the presence of those tombstones there was considered a security hazard. So these were all uprooted and brought into the fort. And if you can see, this is the tombstone of Elizabeth Baker, and this happens to be the oldest English tombstone in Madras. This woman died in the sea in the 1650s. Her husband R.N. Baker was an agent here, and then her body was brought here and buried, and this is the stone. And this is on the wall, and this is Greenhill's tomb, where the man who was much swelled and then had to be pierced in order to let out the body fluid. This is the arch which goes under the spire of the church. The church is full of such corners, beautiful place. Then you have the chaplain's house. Now the chaplains of Fort St. George require a study by themselves. Most of them were absolute crooks. And understandably, the British officers were not keen that there should be a British chaplain coming to take care of them under any circumstance, because they would find out what was happening and then report back to England. So we have the very interesting story of Mr. Park, Robert Park, who came here and then went on to become, here it is. The Reverend Mr. Park, for instance, came out to India on a ship called the Namur, and he then secured employment as one of the company's chaplains. Later, we find that he becomes the bullock cart supplier to Robert Clive. So he gets a victualling contract, and he was employed as paymaster and commissary of the troops. Can you believe a man of God going and funding the troops for fighting wars? He was sent on political missions to Tanjore, Sadras and Pondicherry, and at last was ordered by the company to revert home. And 2 years later he went home with a reasonable fortune obtained by trade and presents. And in 1760, hold your breath, he comes back as the governor of Madras, a post that he filled from 1763 to 1767. And during that time, he cast over the place something of the shadow of his black gown. That, however, signified dullness rather than virtue. Finally, he bought a baronetcy, became Sir Robert Park, and a mansion in Devonshire. So this was not the only one. We also have Parson Salmon. He was encouraged in his duties by receiving the appointment of Secretary to the Board of Police of Madras in 1770 to supplement his salary. But this was not enough for him. He resigned, went to Bengal, got Warren Hastings to introduce him to the Nawab of the Carnatic, and last appears in Madras as the manager of the gun factory for the Maharaja of Tanjore. By him he may be, and the other man was the Reverend St. John Brown, who shortly after his arrival was punishing his servants for some misdemeanor, when one of them fell in trying to escape his blows from a terrace some 20 feet high. The wretched man was left lying there all night and died 2 days later. The most charitable explanation given was that the chaplain was drunk when he did it. So this is the house of the chaplain, and this is where the Reverend St. John or whatever he was must have done what he did to the servant. And then you have the church, and next to the church you will find a building with pillars, and that was the Fort Town Hall. This was where the important people of Madras met in order to finalize important events and decisions and things like that. And this is where, on September 29, 1688, the governor met along with certain important people to announce that the city has a corporation, thereby making it the oldest corporation in the entire country and one of the oldest corporations in the whole world. And on that day, they elected a mayor, aldermen and burgesses. And what is very interesting is that the robe of the mayor and the aldermen, as defined then, continues to be used even now. And the man who gave the color combination was Josiah Child, that dreadful chairman of East India Company. He says, this being a hot country, they should wear scarlet robes of light silk. And then he describes how the mayor should proceed in procession with the mace being carried forward in front of him, with the aldermen and the burgesses coming behind. And even then, he said that if the mayor and the corporation men cannot all be English, so you need to have some Portuguese, some Armenians, some Telugu and some Tamil. So you know how we work, don't we? The first 3 Indians were all friends and nephews of the most influential man of Madras at that time. A man called Kasi Veeranna, who was the chief Zubashka of the East India Company. His two partners and his grandson all made it to become corporation councillors. And the grandson was only 15. So he still holds the record for being the youngest corporation councillor possible. God knows what he would have done sitting on the corporation. Close to where St. Mary's Church is, you have a street called Snob's Alley. It's also known as St. Thomas Street. And this is where the well-to-do people lived, because this is closest to the sea. You get the sea breeze coming in at all times, and therefore this is where the rich, this is why it came to be known as Snob's Alley. Its official name is St. Thomas's Street. It is something like Kolakkarapete being something else in reality. So even now there's a board which says Snob's Alley, and then you go down it. You come to the last house that is standing there. This is a genuine 1650s structure. The topmost floor alone is a later addition post 1758, when, thanks to the French siege, the top structure was bombarded and reconstructed. But the ground floor and the first floor go back to the 1650s. So it's a genuine relic of the oldest period of the fort. The Archaeological Survey of India has been putting up a board all around it saying building in a weak condition, awaiting restoration. That board has been there for 20 years because I came to Madras in 93. Now they have put a green cloth all around it to indicate that some work is going on inside it. You can go there at any time, you won't find one human being doing any work. So it's just left to the elements, it's carrying on that way. This is yet another interesting building, and this is Clive's house, also known as the Admiralty House. And Clive lived here after he got married to Margaret Maskelyne. There are several histories to this building, but the most succinct explanation is in Mr. Muttaya's book. So I'm going to read out from that. This was called the Great House in Charles Street, and it was owned by Armenian merchants. Aga Shaumier inherited from his father a house famous in Madras history, the Great House in Charles Street, now partially occupied by the Archaeological Survey of India's regional office, which restored a part of it recently. This house had belonged to the phenomenally successful Khoja Nazar Jacob Jan, who lived in Madras from 1702 and is the first Armenian settler in the city to be identified with a history. There certainly were earlier Armenian settlers in Madras, but being not as prominent or as successful as Khoja Nazar, their contributions have been lost in the mists of time. On Khoja Nazar's death in 1740, the house had much of his property passed on to his son and so on and so forth, but we come back to the house. The house in 1750 became the official residence of the Deputy Governor of Madras on a rent of 30 pagodas a month. Robert Clive also lived here for some time, so the better known name Clive House. Eventually, Shaumier sold it to a Portuguese, De Castro, who in turn sold it for 6,000 pagodas to the company in 1755. And they bought it to accommodate visitors. Admiral Watson came to stay and hold court here in 1758, a precedent leading to the courts of Admiralty sitting here and the name Admiralty House. So this is where Clive's Corner is, and this is where the Archaeological Survey has its office. It's a beautifully maintained building. This is a not so beautifully maintained building, and a part of it has collapsed. The reason why I am not showing you that part is, I wanted to see this little black plaque over here which is completely faded. But those of you with good eyesight and vision, which is not me, if you go close by, you can make out that it commemorates the fact that Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, lived in this particular house. Arthur Wellesley was then a soldier, came to Madras in the 1790s. His elder brother was the Governor General of India, Lord Mornington, later the Marquis of Wellesley, who was hell-bent on destroying Tipu Sultan. Arthur Wellesley came to Madras, and naturally when your elder brother is the Governor General, you don't think the local governor is of any importance. So he began writing letters about how Lord Clive, not Robert Clive but his son, was an absolute dud. And intelligence is the last thing that you can associate with him. These were all letters that he wrote to his elder brother. So the elder brother one fine morning came down to Madras and settled here. The Governor General came down. He said that I have to lead the campaign against Tipu Sultan in person. And he moved into Admiralty House. Wellesley living here, his elder brother living in Admiralty House. Very interestingly, the book Memories of Madras says that there would have been a severe crisis, but this was averted. That crisis was that Lady Mornington did not come down to Madras, and so Lady Clive continued to hold forth as the senior most lady in the Madras government. Lord Clive was not given any importance, so he shifted into a garden house outside, and Lord Mornington and his brother Arthur Wellesley conducted the campaign against Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan was finally defeated. Arthur Wellesley became Sir Arthur Wellesley for doing nothing much. He just fell off a horse sometime in between. And then he went and did very well in the Battle of Assaye, went back to England, and then scored his greatest success, which was the defeat of Napoleon. And finally became the Prime Minister of England. So this was the house where he lived. One part of it is completely gone, and the other half is just standing very, very precariously. This is the Grand Arsenal where the arms and ammunition was stored, a building that was built in 1755 by a combination of two people who were completely in cahoots with each other and built everything in cahoots with each other. Colonel Patrick Ross, John Call and Paul Benfield. The three of them were officially employees of the East India Company, and they were responsible for much of the fort's reconstruction. But when they floated tenders, they floated it in such a way that only Benfield could quote successfully for it. So he was an employee and he was also bidding for the tenders. So it's very similar to what goes on even now. We talk about cartelization in the corporation. It's been going on since then. And once the contract was given to somebody who quoted a lower price, and immediately the response from the government that he has not looked into all the features that were needed in his quote. It is only Mr. Benfield who can quote for it. So Benfield built the Grand Arsenal. Behind this, you have a gate of the fort called the Walaja Gate. And the Walaja Gate leads to Walaja Road, Mount Road, from where you go into Chepauk Palace, which was the palace that Benfield built for the Nawab of Arcot. Benfield not only built the palace, he was loaning money to the Nawab of Arcot so that he could pay it back to him to build the palace at rates of interest that were probably 30%, 40% and things like that. And finally, Benfield went back to England to answer charges of corruption, bought a seat for himself as a member of parliament there, defended himself successfully and wanted to come back to Madras, wanted to go to Bengal because he found there was more money to be made there. But Clive, Clive knew when to identify a corrupt man from a great distance, and he wanted only himself. He said, I don't want Benfield in Bengal. So Benfield goes back to England, invests in a number of financial fraudulent schemes, loses all his money, uses his immunity as a member of parliament, goes to Paris where he finally dies. Benfield's life has to be documented in some way. It would make a very interesting life. This is just to give you an idea about the thickness of the gates. So you are standing on this side of the Walaja Gate. This is the size of the arch. Then there is an outer Walaja street. Then there is an outer Walaja Gate. So every gate is actually two gates separated by a street. And the gates are all at right angles to each other. So when a soldier is walking in, he will never be able to know who is standing or hiding on the other side. And the person can pounce on him and kill him immediately. Now this construction was not fully complete when the French came in the 1750s. But all the records say that the French found it impossible to move up the zigzag structure of the glacis of the fort. That is what is mentioned in the record. So this was a successful defense that was constructed by the British. Then you have the moat. The moat at one time watered by the Elambur river, then watered by the sea. Today it is nothing but a glorious ditch. Full of mosquitoes and weeds. There are certain parts of it that have still got water. Some parts of it are of indescribable beauty because it's full of plants and animals, birds chirruping all the time, completely undisturbed. Nobody ever goes there. It's phenomenal. For a nature lover, you just have to stand there and I'm sure you'll find any number of different kinds of birds and animals over there. This is the other gate, which is known as the St. George's Gate. Instruction was left that the St. George's Gate should never be closed at night because many of the gentlemen were going into town to satisfy their biological urges and coming back. So this St. George's Gate would always remain open to let them in after every other gate had been closed. This is the thickness of the fort wall near the St. George's Gate. Then you have the King's Barracks. The King's Barracks, built in 1755, is the largest barracks in India. And today it is in a shocking state of disrepair. Most of it is is filled with rubble inside so that the walls don't collapse, don't kind of cave in. So it's protected by all the rubble that has been filled in. And for the past 2 years, the army has been talking about emptying the King's Barracks and moving over into St. Thomas Mount and handing over the barracks to the Archaeological Survey of India for maintenance. Nothing has happened. This is yet another building that is very interesting, but I have not yet found much of its history. This is on the Parade Square itself. And then we come to one of the last buildings in my presentation, the Fort Museum. The Fort Museum has a long history by itself. It started off as the house of a businessman called Peter Massey Cassin, and then in the 1700s, it became the place where all the merchants would gather to exchange information and trade in commodities. The ships would all be, waiting in the sea just 2 miles away, and it would be plainly visible from the windows of the building. And on top of this building, when it was completed in 1790s, it was built by public subscription by the merchants putting together the money and constructing it. The first floor has got what is called the long room, where they would all meet up and exchange their information. Down below there was a tavern that supplied Madeira and coffee. There was also the Madras Bank. These were all the institutions that grew there. And on top of this building in the 1790s came up the first lighthouse of Madras, operated on vegetable oil and going out into the sea in order to inform the ships. In 1800 or 1801, Lord Clive, the son of Robert Clive, declared that the merchants had no place in the fort and they would have to move out. So the merchants moved into First Line Beach, and this building became the regimental mess. And it continued that way till 1946, when Douglas Reed, the man who wrote the book, The Story of Fort St. George, he was a member of the Madras Legislative Council, and he was the chairman of Beardstell and Company in Madras. He said that the building ought to be converted into a museum for commemorating the history of Madras under the British. And not only he suggested it, he funded the construction of the museum, getting the artifacts. So he is considered to be the father of the Fort Museum. Goes back to England in 1948, by which time the museum is completed. It's wonderful to go inside and see the portraits and the artifacts that are there. What is most significant is on the topmost floor, they have a tattered Indian national flag. That is the only surviving flag from August 15th, 1947 across the entire country. Several places would have hoisted the national flag. They're all lost. This is the only flag that survives, flown from the ramparts of Fort St. George at 5:30 in the morning. Bashir would have been very happy. I'm sure we are all very happy as well. And that flag, it's in a poor condition because it was not maintained for years, but it is still preserved and intact on the topmost floor. Before I conclude, two things. I've not mentioned the life of Hastings. Hastings came to Madras and lived in Church Street, just behind the church. And for a man who was living behind the church, he led a very unusual domestic life, because he had made friends with a married lady on a ship coming down, and the married lady, the husband and Hastings lived happily together in Church Street. And he was Baron Imhoff, who was a failed soldier but a successful artist, or a so-called successful artist, who had come down to try his hand in painting the Nawabs and the Nawabs. And along with him came his wife Mary Ann. And then Imhoff one day left for Calcutta to try his luck there. But Mary Ann stayed back. She didn't go with her husband. So Hastings and Mary Ann lived here for some time. Every tongue wagged, and I'm sure between Mylapore and Thandayapete, everybody must have been talking about it. Then one day, Hastings became the governor of Bengal. Nobody could touch him thereafter. So she also went along with him to Calcutta. The husband, in the meantime, went back to England, was bought off with a handsome amount of money, filed for divorce, and then Hastings married Mary Ann. And they really lived happily ever after. So that romance took place in this fort in Church Street. But this building, which is I think the last of my slides, the reason I brought it here is this is what is happening to the fort. This is called the Namakkal Kavignir Malige, built as the extension to the Secretariat in the 1980s. What stood here was a church that was even older than the Church of St. Mary's. That was the first church, the Capuchin church, built for the Portuguese settlers inside Fort St. George, with French priests coming in. In fact, a very interesting story is this man called Father Ephraim de Nevers, who is on his way to some place in Indonesia. This is in the early 1600s, and he comes to Goa, and he's deposited in Goa. So he's told that to go to Indonesia, you've got to go to Madras. So he comes all the way to Madras. Once he comes here, the Portuguese find him to be so good that they tell the British government that you can't let him go. He has to stay here, and he's got to be our padre. He's got to take care of our well-being. So they convince him to stay back, but he is very much afraid that the church in Rome is going to be furious because he's a Roman Catholic. And San Thome is a Roman Catholic town, and they are writing letters to Rome saying that this fellow is there. So what happens is, one day Ephraim de Nevers is going for a walk when San Thome people come and kidnap him and take him into San Thome. So Governor Greenhill of Fort St. George bides this time till the Portuguese padre comes for a walk on Marina, and he kidnaps him and brings him into Fort St. George. But that fellow is made of very stern stuff. He climbs over the walls and escapes. And then the English are left at a loose end. Finally they ransom Ephraim de Nevers. But by the time he's put on a ship and sent to Goa to face the Inquisition, finally he is brought back, and because he is brought back, the church in Rome says that we will have two dioceses. One will be the diocese of Mylapore, which will be on this side of the Kuam. The other will be the diocese of Madras, which will be on this side of the Kuam, where Ephraim de Nevers can continue to preach. Now, just to come back, that building was called, that church was demolished during the French invasion. But the area was called the Portuguese Square, and it had some of the oldest structures in the fort. But in 1982, when the building had to be built, those buildings were all denotified as heritage buildings. So all you need is a stroke of a pen to do it. And then the structures were demolished, and then this building was put up. Now, last house on Snobs Alley is standing from 1650 without any maintenance. But this structure, built in 1982, developed cracks by 1995 or 1996, became unfit for human habitation, and then had to have a restoration. Now, there was a big debate in the 2000s as to whether it should be restored or whether it should be demolished. And you know what it was finally classified as? An example of modern Chola architecture, and therefore it has to be preserved. And that is how this building has survived, and it is standing right in the heart of a fort like this, so like a sore thumb. And this is the problem with Fort St. George today. Books are plentiful, people will write romantic stories about it. When you go there, you still find all those vestiges, you find it very nice. I have not even touched on the guns and all in Fort St. George. There's a lot more to it. But the thing is that the fort is always under threat, because it's got a multiplicity of owners. You've got the army, you've got the Archaeological Survey of India, you've got the Secretariat, you've got the Tamil Nadu government, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, you've got the Navy. You've got so many people who all own parts of the fort. And you know, as David Ogilvy said, a committee can never come to a decision. And therefore, the bits and pieces of the fort keep falling off. And we are forgetting bits and pieces also. Mr. Mutaya mentioned, just this evening before the program began, about Clive's Library. Now, I know that Intact has recently been approached about it, and whether there is a Clive's Library. There is a building that is designated as Clive's Library, which belongs to the Navy, and none of us can go there. It's in a very weak condition. But what is interesting is, there are references to a library right across the history of Fort St. George. In 1664, the library was started. There were rules framed on how to lend books. And it is very similar to that of a modern library. You cannot keep books for beyond a certain point of time. Fines have to be collected. And people, when they leave the fort, they used to donate their books to the library and things like that. So it's one small story that is quite forgotten, and then you've got to search for it in order to find facts for it. So gradually the history of the fort is getting lost because of the poor maintenance, and also because there is a public perception that the fort is inaccessible. That is not true. All of you must go to the fort. In fact, if more and more people go and see it, there will be a move to maintain parts of the fort. And the fort is open to everybody. You have to get in through a side gate on the front itself. You have to sign your name in a register, and then you are completely left to yourself. You can wander around, you can see whatever you want to. And I want all of you to go, this being the 375th year of the fort. This, I think, is the finest tribute that we can pay by going there and seeing all the monuments in it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sriram. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you, sir.
And we hope all of you enjoyed it.
Yes.
We have 10 minutes for questions. Anyone raise your hands?
You said during the reign of King James II, the flag went up on the teak mast. You said in the reign of King James II, the British flag went up on the teak mast, the oldest flag post. Could you tell us something about the flag? It couldn't have been the Union Jack, because the Act of Union had not taken place then.
But it says the Union, the flag of the Union. That is what is mentioned in the company consultation records. As to what the flag was, there is a visual of it. Yeah. This was the flag that was then flying over the rampart of the fort.
This is the old English flag.
This is the flag.
Maintaining a garrison for whom were the British fighting?
Well, initially the French and the Dutch, whom they were very afraid of, but the Dutch never came here. Later, Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, and they came almost up to the entrance of the fort. They threatened even Government House, which is the Oman Durar estate today. And you also had Chhatrapati Shivaji, who came into the city one night. So these were all the threats. But after 1799, in fact, it is very ironic that the complete reconstruction of the fort as a defensible entity, by the time it was completed, there were no wars to be fought. All the wars had got over before that.
Sir, the rules in our club is I call the people up. Please for question.
Sir, you have forgotten about Rebel Muthuramalingam being lodged as a prisoner, the king of Ramnad?
I have not come across in my readings anything in connection with that, which is why I did not mention it. But I'm sure there must be some fact in a book or two which I have not yet come across. I'll definitely add it to my presentation.
Thank you.
Have you taken any documentary movies, sir?
It is bad enough going with a still camera. Let me tell you that when you go there with a still camera and you're just wandering around, after half an hour somebody will come and ask you, very polite, huh? There is no intimidation of any kind. And then you've got to tell them that I'm a student or I'm a writer, and then and if you say you're from the Hindu and all, then they don't do anything. But movie camera and all, no question.
Yeah.
Sir, this is a good old heritage building. How many times it was renovated? Any individual who took more interest in maintaining this?
I don't know about that. I have no idea, but currently its maintenance is not in a very good shape. That's all I can say.
One more supplement.
No.
So one more.
No. Follow the rules of the club, please.
Use the mic.
Yeah.
And the question is, in all the books that you have mentioned, is there any mention of a survey school, because that was the first engineering survey school?
Mr. Mutayya's book itself has all the details of the survey school. And in fact, it traces the history of the College of Engineering from the survey school.
The location of the school?
The exact location in the fort is not mentioned anywhere. It just says that it started in the fort. That's all.
Any other questions? Yep.
Do they allow film shoots inside the fort?
I'm sure if you know someone, if you are a Manavadu, as they say, you can get it. For us, it's only Jharkhandi at this point.
Any other questions? Okay, we do the second round.
Sir, you listed lot of books authored by European. I think, I presume, no Tamil scholar or historian attempted. He is written in English. I am a regional language.
Narasayya's book is there, Madrasapatnam.
Not only Madras, entire thing.
Yeah, but a significant
about
portion
this.
of it deals with the fort. Significant portion.
There was a reference I have seen, but schedule a separate book on this.
Since you spent a lot of time in the fort, why don't you do it? Much of your life in the fort, right? Time for you to do it.
Yeah, one more quick question. So, apart from the books, is there anything in the Madras archives or the...
I'm sure there will be. I'm sure there will be.
Have you had access to that?
I haven't tried also, frankly, because I have not had the time to do that. And now, you know, one interesting thing is so much of all that is coming out on the internet gradually. The other day, I don't have the link here, the consultation of Fort St. George, that is every day's transaction in the fort, between 1650 to 1750 is now available on a link. You just have to read it every day. You keep pushing. You know, it's difficult to understand what is written in many places. But they have done a good job. I don't know who has done it. It is definitely not done from here. Every day you find some new material coming up. And so there is a lot of interesting material available. I always say, and Sir also says, that it's only, we only scratch the surface. There is so much more that is available.
To add to that, when Dodwell was the curator of the fort, and later when Baliga was curator, a lot of the public consultations were printed and bound in small books. And at one point in time, we were selling the books at about, I think the maximum was 3 rupees, the lowest was 1 rupee a book per year. And I virtually got all those books at that point in time. Unfortunately, they got flooded out one day and I lost a lot of it, but some of it is still there. So I don't know whether they're still having those books for sale, but if you go to the archives and check, they might still have books for sale. At 1 rupee and 3 rupees, still the price hasn't changed. Yeah.
Can I take it from your discussion that the British established Madras before they established Calcutta?
Of course, certainly. Madras predates Calcutta by a good 50 years.
And Bombay by 35.
35 years.
She has.
Where is the Elambur river now? Does it exist?
It doesn't exist. It's subsumed into Buckingham Canal, something into the Kuvam, several things. So it just doesn't exist anymore.
There's somebody there? Another question?
Can I ask one?
Yes, Prema.
Is the government sitting there is good for the fort or bad?
Good for the fort. Because there is a certain element of maintenance that goes on because of that. Failing which, I don't know if you remember that brief period when there was no government in the fort. You could walk in anywhere and do whatever you wanted to, and that is not really what it ought to be.
You mentioned, you talked about Lord Cornwallis. There's one interesting thing about him which you did not mention. He was the commander of the British Army, which surrendered to George Washington and the Americans.
That's right.
And that assured American independence. So Lord Cornwallis was the British commander who surrendered to George Washington.
And that was why he was rewarded with the Governor Generalship.
You know, you say Fort St. George. Is there, it's not one place as one imagines, you know, it's a fort. It seems to be a whole area. Now, is there
it's a town by itself, 40 acres within the compound, within the wall, and 60 acres the glacis that extends outside. So totally 100 acres is the fort.
Oh, there is a survey defining what Fort St. George is.
Exactly, there is. In fact, aerially you can still see parts of that
the wall,
crenellated wall. The inner fort wall survives completely intact.
Yeah. About 100 acres.
That's right.
Was that much like the Black Town and the White Town?
This is the White
that
Town.
you had in Bombay.
This is White Town.
It's a
Black
White
Town is behind Georgetown.
So when you have the modern Chora, as mentioned, is everybody living in denial of the colonial period? How do you get everyone to understand that it's part of the heritage?
You don't.
That's rather like that. The Mylapore divide.
Exactly.
Like T.M. Krishna talks.
Anyone else? If there isn't, thank you very much. And please go and spend that time in the fort. It's really worthwhile to spend time, just not a quick round of it. Merely spending time in St. Mary's Church, you'll find a whole lot of fascinating stories. in all the plaques which are there, and so on and so forth. So if you have somebody who knows the stories and things, it's really fascinating. In St. Mary's Fort, I always go and look at one particular plaque which says, this Lieutenant Colonel or whatever he was, so and so, died of coup de soleil. Anyone know what it is? I'm fascinated by that plaque. Sunstroke.
Sun. Okay.
And if I know all the little things.
Oh, coup de soleil, the sunstruck. Like to have a coup.
Thank you very much. The next meeting
the coup de
is on the 23rd of the Panamana. We go back to our old times. 6:30 p.m. for tea and 7 p.m. the meeting. The book is a book called How to pronounce it? Hadar by C.P. Surendran, who is a well-known journalist in Bombay and who recently resigned from one of the leading papers in Bombay. And this book, he'll be in conversation with filmmaker Rajiv Meena. It will be on 23rd. Thank you all very much. And once again, thank you for your cooperation with your identity cards.